The ship that was never meant to turn a profit, okay? So you want to build the biggest ship in the world. You picture the obvious version of the story. You raise the money, you hire the best shipyard on the planet, you build something enormous, and then you sell tickets until the thing pays for itself. Simple business. Big boat, big fares, big profit. That is not what happened. Not even close. The ship in question is the Titanic, and if you only look at what she cost to build against what a single crossing could earn in ticket sales, the entire project makes no sense. Somebody spent an amount of money equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms on a vessel that could never, ever pay for itself through fares alone. Not in one voyage, not in 10 voyages, not really ever, on paper. So why did anyone build her? Because nobody was actually trying to sell tickets. They were trying to own an ocean. Let's start with what she cost, because this is where the naive version of the story falls apart immediately. Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilder in Belfast, put the construction bill for the Titanic at around £1.5 million. Convert that into contemporary American dollars at the time, and you land somewhere close to $7.5 million. Adjust that for what money is worth today, and you are talking about something on the order of $200 million, maybe more, just to put one ship in the water. Now here's the part that should stop you. That price was not fixed in advance. It was not a quote. It was not a bid that Harland and Wolff had to hit or eat the difference. The shipyard worked under what is essentially an open tab. Whatever steel, whatever labor, whatever fittings were required, the yard billed the White Star Line for the actual cost, and then added a flat commission on top, somewhere around 5% as their profit. There was no incentive anywhere in that arrangement to economize. None. If anything, the incentive ran the other way because a bigger bill meant a bigger commission. Think about what that means for a moment. Most businesses are built around minimizing cost. This one was structurally built around the opposite. The shipyard had every reason to use the best steel, the most elaborate woodwork, the most advanced engines available, because someone else was footing the bill and paying them a percentage on top of whatever that bill came to. That is why the interiors ended up as extravagant as they did. Not because someone got carried away with taste. Because the financial structure removed the ceiling entirely. But even understanding that cost-plus arrangement, you still haven't gotten to the real question. If ticket sales could never come close to recovering an outlay like that, somebody still had to be willing to write the check. And whoever wrote it wasn't doing it because they loved ships. Meet John Pierpont Morgan, an American financier, already one of the wealthiest men alive by the turn of the 20th century, the same man who had already assembled United States Steel and effectively controlled huge portions of American railroading. By the time he turned his attention to the North Atlantic, he had already proven, more than once, that his real skill wasn't building things. It was buying up an entire industry until there was no one left to compete with. In 1902, Morgan put together something called the International Mercantile Marine Company. It was a holding company chartered in New Jersey, capitalized at roughly $120 million in bonds and stock combined. Its purpose was simple to state and enormous in ambition. Buy up the major shipping lines running between Europe and America, put them all under one financial roof, and end the price wars between them for good. Under that umbrella, Morgan's company scooped up the American Line, the Red Star Line, the Atlantic Transport Line, the Leyland Line, and, most importantly for our purposes, the White Star Line, the company that would go on to build and operate the Titanic. Here's the detail that trips most people up. Morgan was an American. Under British law, foreign nationals could not directly own British-registered ships. So he didn't. He owned the company that owned the company that owned the ships. White Star kept its British registry, kept flying the British flag, kept its British officers and crews, but the profits, the strategic direction, and the ultimate financial risk flowed straight back to Morgan's holding company in New Jersey. So when people say the Titanic was a British ship, that's true on paper. In practice, for all financial purposes, an American banking syndicate owned her. And here's a detail worth sitting with for a second. Morgan himself had booking on Titanic's maiden voyage. He canceled it days before departure, citing his health and other business in Europe. The man whose financial empire built the ship wasn't on it when it sank. Now, why would Wall Street want to own shipping lines instead of just funding one enormous vessel? Because owning a single record-breaking ship gets you headlines. Owning the majority of the trade routes gets you pricing power. Morgan wasn't buying a boat. He was trying to do to the Atlantic Ocean what he had already done to American steel and American railroads. Eliminate competition by owning most of it. But there was a wrinkle. The British government was not thrilled about an American financier quietly controlling a fleet that also functioned as a naval reserve in wartime. So London struck back, not through regulation, but through subsidy. The government handed Cunard Line, White Star's chief remaining British rival, a low-interest loan worth around £2,600,000, plus an ongoing operating subsidy, specifically so Cunard could build 2 superliners fast enough to reclaim bragging rights for speed across the Atlantic. Those ships became the Lusitania and the Mauretania. White Star could not match that kind of government-backed subsidy dollar for dollar. So White Star's leadership made a decision that would define the next chapter of the story. If they couldn't win on speed, they would win on scale, comfort, and sheer size. That decision is the entire reason the Titanic ended up looking the way she did. Here's something that rarely gets mentioned. The Titanic was never meant to exist alone. She was 1/3 of a coordinated 3-ship investment. The Olympic, the Titanic, and later the Britannic. At first glance, that seems like an odd way to spend money. If you're worried about the enormous capital outlay of one giant ship, why would you commit to building 3 nearly identical ones? Because the economics of running a transatlantic passenger service don't work off of one flagship. They work off of a reliable, repeating schedule. Customers, especially the ones paying for mail contracts and freight, want departures on a fixed weekly rhythm, not whenever one ship happens to be available. A single ship, however magnificent, cannot maintain a weekly Southampton to New York service by itself, because it also needs time in port, time for maintenance, and time for the return crossing. 3 ships run on a rotation could maintain that weekly departure schedule indefinitely. There's also a quieter financial logic underneath that. Building all 3 together let White Star and Harland and Wolff spread enormous fixed costs across multiple hulls instead of absorbing them into a single ship's price tag. The shipyard had to physically rebuild its slipways to handle vessels of this size, including a gantry structure roughly 228 feet tall, built specifically to tower over ships the size of Olympic and Titanic. That is an enormous capital expense. Spread it across 3 ships instead of 1, and the unit cost per vessel goes down. The same logic applied to design work, blueprints, and standardized parts. Once the engineering was done for the first ship, it could largely be reused, with adjustments, for the next 2. So the choice to build 3 giants wasn't extravagance for its own sake. It was an attempt to lower the average cost per ship while simultaneously locking in a scheduling advantage no single vessel could offer. But that raises an obvious tension. If the whole point of building at this scale was to lower costs, why did White Star then turn around and fill these ships with some of the most expensive luxury features ever put to sea? Here's where you have to stop thinking of the Titanic as one business and start thinking of her as several different businesses stacked inside a single hull. At the top sat first class, and first class alone had its own internal tiers. The very best suites, the parlor suites with private promenade decks, could run as high as roughly £870 for a single crossing during peak season. In dollars of that era, that's over $4,000 for one trip. At a time when the average laborer might not see that much money across several years of work, passengers paying that kind of fare weren't just buying a bed. They were buying Turkish baths, a squash court, electric baths, and dining rooms designed to look like they belonged in Paris. And critically, White Star found a way to make even more money off these passengers beyond the ticket price itself. The most famous example is the a la carte restaurant, which wasn't run by White Star at all. It was leased out to an independent restaurateur named Luigi Gatti, who brought in his own staff of more than 60 chefs, waiters, and wine specialists, paid them out of his own restaurant's earnings, and paid White Star a lease fee for the privilege of serving first-class passengers who wanted something better than the standard dining saloon. Passengers who used Gatti's restaurant even got a small rebate on their ticket because they were now generating separate revenue for a totally different business operating out of the same room. That's the wealthy end of the ship. But here is the number that actually matters more. Over half the people on board Titanic were not wealthy at all. They were traveling in second and, overwhelmingly, third class. Third class, often called steerage, cost somewhere between roughly £7 and £9 per ticket. That's a tiny fraction of what a first-class suite cost. But it wasn't the fare size that mattered. It was the volume and the reliability. At the start of the 20th century, there was a constant, predictable stream of emigrants leaving Europe for the United States and Canada, searching for work. This wasn't seasonal tourism. It was consistent, month after month, driven by industrialization pulling labor across the ocean. 1,000 third-class passengers, each paying £7 to £9, generated a guaranteed baseline of several £1,000s per crossing before a single first-class ticket was even counted. And the cost of housing and feeding a third-class passenger was, per person, far lower than the cost of maintaining a first-class suite. Titanic actually improved third-class conditions compared to older ships, replacing open dormitories with enclosed small cabins and giving steerage passengers dedicated dining rooms. That wasn't charity, it was a competitive move. If your steerage accommodations were noticeably better than arrival lines, emigrants would choose your ship, even at a similar price, without you having to spend anywhere near what first class cost to maintain. On top of passenger fares, add mail contracts. The Titanic sailed as a Royal Mail ship, under contract with the British Postal Service and the American Postal Service, carrying bags of mail across the Atlantic for a fee. Add freight and cargo space, carrying everything from bulk goods to, on that maiden voyage, even a motor car. None of this made headlines. All of it kept cash flowing, so the picture becomes clear. The glamorous first-class suites generated eye-catching per-passenger margins. But it was the unglamorous volume of steerage passengers, mail contracts, and freight that provided the dependable, boring cash flow the entire operation was actually built on. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the revenue side was this diversified, spreading risk across luxury fares, mass emigration, government mail contracts, and freight, why was the parent company still under constant financial strain? Because operating a ship this size, every single day, was staggeringly expensive. Regardless of how many tickets you sold, start with fuel. Titanic's engines burned through roughly 600 tons of coal every 24 hours. To sustain that burn rate across an entire crossing, she left port carrying over 6,000 tons of coal in her bunkers. Feeding that many furnaces required close to 180 men, firemen and trimmers, working in punishing 6-hour shifts around the clock, shoveling coal in temperatures that would be unbearable by almost any modern workplace standard. Then there's payroll. Titanic carried more than 900 crew members. Officers might earn around £17 a month. Stewards and firemen might earn closer to £5 or £6 a month. Multiply that across 900 people every single voyage, whether the ship was full or half empty, and underneath all of that sat the costs that never stop, even when the ship is sitting quietly in port. Harbor fees, pilotage, insurance premiums, ongoing maintenance, depreciation on an asset that cost roughly £1.5 million to build in the first place. Put all of that together, and you start to understand why, despite diversified revenue, despite a captive customer base of emigrants and elites alike, the profit margins on operating a ship like this were thin. Not because the business model was flawed, because the fixed costs of moving something this enormous across an ocean every single week were enormous by default, which brings us to the most dangerous part of any capital-intensive business. What happens when something catastrophic wipes out the asset entirely? A lot of people assume that when the Titanic sank, insurance made White Star whole. It didn't. Not close. The ship, which cost roughly £1.5 million to build, was insured for £1 million. The broker, Willis Faber and Company, placed that policy through Lloyd's of London in January of 1912, spreading the risk across roughly a dozen insurance companies and more than 50 separate underwriting syndicates at Lloyd's. Individual underwriters signed on for anywhere between a few £100 and £75,000 each, which is exactly how large-scale insurance markets protect themselves. Nobody takes on the whole risk alone. The premium for that £1 million of coverage was remarkably cheap, around £7,500, largely because the ship had been marketed everywhere as effectively unsinkable, and insurers priced the risk accordingly. When the ship went down in April of 1912, Lloyd's paid out the full £1 million within about 30 days, which was, and still is, held up as an example of the insurance market functioning exactly as it should under pressure. But do the math. £1 million in insurance against £1.5 million in construction cost leaves a gap of roughly £500,000, absorbed directly by White Star and its parent company, with no one to reimburse them. And that's before counting the wave of legal claims filed afterward by grieving families, which initially totaled well into the millions of dollars, before eventually being settled years later for a small fraction of that, under maritime laws that sharply limited a shipowner's liability. So no, insurance did not make anyone whole. It softened the blow. The company still took a direct hit worth roughly a third of what the ship cost to build in the first place. Here's the part that surprises people. White Star Line did not collapse after the sinking. The reason is almost boring, in the best way. Titanic was never the whole business. She was one asset inside a much larger corporate structure. Her sister ship, the Olympic, kept sailing, kept earning money, and went on to serve for more than 2 decades, eventually earning the nickname Old Reliable. The parent trust, Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company, held stakes across multiple shipping lines and multiple routes, which meant that losing one ship, even a famous one, did not mean losing the business. That said, the parent company was not in great shape underneath the surface. It had been over-leveraged from the start, carrying heavy bond debt from its formation back in 1902. By 1914, the trust actually defaulted on its bond interest payments and entered a kind of negotiated receivership the following year. What ultimately rescued it wasn't a brilliant turnaround plan. It was the outbreak of the First World War, which sent shipping freight rates soaring and pulled the company back into profitability almost by accident, so the sinking didn't sink the company. Over-leveraging nearly did that on its own, years later, and the war accidentally bailed everyone out. But the disaster did permanently change something else. Something bigger than any one company's balance sheet. It changed the economics of the entire shipping industry, everywhere, for good. Before the disaster, lifeboat requirements for British ships were based on an outdated formula tied to a vessel's gross tonnage, not the number of people actually on board. Under that formula, ships over 10,000 tons only needed to carry a fixed number of lifeboats, meaning an enormous liner like Titanic could be completely legal while only carrying enough lifeboats for a fraction of the people sailing on her. After the sinking, international maritime authorities gathered and drafted a new safety agreement, formally established in 1914, generally known by the acronym SOLAS, short for Safety of Life at Sea. It required, among other things, lifeboat capacity for every single person aboard a ship, not just a fixed number based on tonnage. It required ships to maintain a continuous 24-hour wireless radio watch, so a distress call could never again go unheard simply because the radio operator had gone to bed. It pushed for stronger internal structural design, including double bottoms and taller watertight compartments. And it led to the creation of a permanent iceberg monitoring service in the North Atlantic, funded jointly by the maritime nations that used those shipping lanes. None of that was free. Every one of those requirements raised the cost of building and operating a passenger ship for every company in the industry, everywhere permanently, which leads to an interesting twist. If new regulation raised costs across the board, someone, somewhere, still profited from all of that new spending. Shipyards benefited because existing fleets now needed retrofitting to meet the new safety standards. Harland and Wolff itself pulled the Olympic out of service specifically to add additional internal watertight protection and an inner hull skin, work that had to be paid for. Wireless communication companies benefited enormously. Once every passenger ship was legally required to maintain round-the-clock radio watch, demand for wireless equipment and trained radio operators expanded across the entire industry almost overnight. Manufacturers of lifeboats, davits, and life-saving equipment saw a surge in orders. Because suddenly every liner afloat needed enough lifeboat capacity for everyone on board, not just a fraction. And insurers, having just absorbed one of the largest marine losses in history, adjusted their risk models and their premiums upward across the industry, which over time increased their overall revenue from underwriting these massive hulls. In other words, the biggest financial winners from the Titanic disaster weren't the shipping lines. They were the industries that supplied the safety equipment, the technology, and the insurance that the disaster proved was necessary. Step back and look at the whole picture again. If you only measure the Titanic against the ticket revenue from her single, unfinished maiden voyage, she looks like the worst investment imaginable. Enormous cost, immediate total loss, insurance that barely covered 2/3 of the construction bill, but that was never the timeline anyone building her was working on. Olympic-class ships were meant to anchor White Star's market position for 20 to 30 years, not 20 to 30 days. The entire strategy, from Morgan's original trust formation in 1902, through the decision to build 3 sister ships instead of 1, through the decision to compete on size and comfort instead of speed, was built around long-term market dominance, not quarterly ticket revenue. Judged against that actual timeline, the disaster wasn't a failed business plan. It was an interrupted one. The investment thesis wasn't broken. It was simply cut off abruptly 4 days into a multi-decade bet. So here's the real misconception worth clearing up. Most people remember the Titanic as an engineering story, or a human tragedy, which of course it also is. But underneath all of that, she was a financial instrument first. A ship commissioned not because passengers were begging for something bigger, but because a Wall Street financier was trying to buy control of an ocean trade route the same way he had already bought control of American steel and American railroads. She wasn't built to be the cheapest way to cross the Atlantic. She was built because scale, at that size, promised long-term market control that no single voyage's ticket sales could ever measure. Every feature on board, from the grand staircase down to the redesigned third-class cabins, reflected a calculated bet about which passengers to court and how to extract value from each one of them differently. And in the end, her sinking didn't just cost one company roughly £500,000 it could never recover. It rewrote the economics of an entire global industry, permanently raising the cost of doing business for every shipping line on Earth. in a way that 100 successful crossings never could have. That's the part of the story that rarely makes it into the movie. The ship wasn't just a tragedy. She was a financial bet, placed by one of the most powerful bankers in the world, on the idea that owning the ocean was worth more than owning a single boat. And when that bet went down in the North Atlantic, it took the old rules of an entire industry down with it.